Welcome back. This is an interview episode of Restoring Darkness. I am Scott Walker, filling in for Michael and Mark this time around. But what really matters is that we're talking to Andy Deprato. He is a med student that has already managed to co-author two papers that were meta-studies that were able to establish a significant correlation between the presence of anthropogenic light at night and the existence and severity of both allergic reactions, seasonal and asthmatic, and cancers, a number of different cancers. In this episode, we're going to get into what goes into building a meta study, how he got into doing this, where he goes from here, what we can do with the information that came out of these studies. But before that, I want to mention that this series is presented entirely due to the partnership of the Lighting and Darkness Foundation, which you can set up a single or recurring donation to improve the use of light at night, either through this show, through training programs that we're starting to build with Nailed. You can visit restoringdarkness.com to find out more information on how to donate and how to support us. But let's get into the interview, which started with me asking Andy whether his interest in health came first or his interest in lighting came first.
Oh, that's a great question. I'd say probably health. I kind of did a undergrad degree in kinesiology, so it's kind of the science of movement, and a lot of people understand that as say like sports and exercise science. So I really like the whole health promotion for the population aspect, and I got involved in some different research through that. But yeah, one of the labs I was with was looking at a bunch of different, say, environmental influences on health, and their main focus was, if you remember a few years ago, close to a decade now, but those big wildfires in Fort McMurray.
Yes.
Yeah, they were actually looking at the lung function of, say, RCMPs and firefighters that went up to go help in those fires. And they were looking at all these different environmental influences. So then the postdoctoral researcher I was working with started to consider other environmental influences. And that's where we saw a lot of research coming out in this light pollution and artificial light at night, and how that could be an influence and exposure to consider. So it kind of naturally flowed from there.
All right. Yeah, because my sister's actually in kin professionally now, and she's
Oh,
so a lot of her work it's a bit of a jump from helping people move their knees to, all right, well, here's a big pile of statistics. Let's weed through them. and
yeah.
and I have to, okay, so a lot of my work here is a little bit autobiographical. So, like, my job is to keep track of an ever growing pile of studies that just indicate what light at night does to you and how it's bad. And, cancer, obesity, anxiety, different cancer, different cardiovascular issues. And then I get to your paper on allergies, and I'm like, oh, this is just insult to injury now. Wait, allergies are worse? And this is where, so tell me about this project.
Yeah, absolutely. So we kind of followed that process. So one of the things, our lab is it was more of an environmental epidemiology perspective. So just like you're describing, of looking at all these potential health outcomes and how they could be related to artificial light at night. And specifically, the type of study we were doing is a systematic review and meta-analysis. And it's kind of a really robust way to look at all of the evidence that's out there on a certain topic and try and identify all published studies considering that. And we had gone through all these health outcomes and realized, hey, okay, well, cancer is pretty well covered, like you've mentioned. But we noticed that so the lab also had a big focus in respiratory medicine, as well as, you might understand, given that they're looking at, say, the forest fires and lung health following those. So we started going through this as an exposure and seeing there were a good number of studies looking at, asthma, allergies, skin allergies as outcomes, but it hadn't really been reviewed. And one of the big things with these reviews is it kind of gives you a better step back overall picture around where the evidence is at, because it's important to do these individual studies to get the information in the first place, but they might give different results just based on how they're performed, all the different variables that can influence their outcomes. So we decided it'd be really worthwhile to kind of get a better, more informed picture by doing a review on that topic. So that's kind of how that came to be.
Yeah, and okay, so I notice a lot of meta studies from my side of things,
Yeah.
just reviewing the news that comes to me. But do you see meta studies on the rise as just a general practice in health research?
hmm That's a great question, actually. I think it's definitely a big trend. I think there's lots of factors behind why that could be. So I go to McMaster University, and one of the things that's pretty significant, I'm pretty proud to go here, is because they are known as the home of evidence-based medicine. And kind of the deal with that is about 40 or so years ago, there were things that informed practice, but they were kind of based more so on expert opinion, for instance. And this doesn't just apply to medicine; it could apply to many different policies and decision making. But the thing with that is why are we making these decisions? So reviews are a way to synthesize all the evidence on a topic. And because of that, if you ever Google hierarchy of evidence, you'll get a pyramid picture and it'll show expert opinion on the bottom because that's not necessarily vetted information, even though it can be quite valuable because you
Well,
can't research
anecdotes are the
everything.
plural of anecdote isn't data.
I haven't heard that one before. That's a good one.
Oh, that's something that comes from I think I forget where it's probably comes from the anti-vaxxer crowd actually.
Uh, I see. Right. Yeah, but then you can get these different studies. And the thing that's interesting with this is you can't necessarily study everything in every different way. So, for example, one of the gold standards of study design is a RCT, a randomized control trial. You can't really do that in artificial light at night because that's too much of an exposure to randomize people to.
Oh
So,
yeah,
what we really see.
and there's been these two recent studies that
Oh,
the
really?
UK one. So there was a study out of the UK that used chest-mounted dosimeters on like
Right.
it was 10,000 people, and
Wow.
they get to say, oh, we collected 7 million hours of data, but when you have 10,000 people doing it, that's only a couple of weeks when you think
Right.
about it. And then there was
Huh.
this other study. Oh God, this is where I should take better notes of my own of my own work. But I think it was from Norway, and the dosimeters were actually mounted to an eyeglass, and they found
Mhm.
that even just compliance for wearing the eyeglasses was only at about 89%.
Yeah.
So
That's really interesting, yeah. But
like
yeah,
when like it's a lot like how diet research can't work because you need absolute control over diets, and that's illegal.
yeah. Absolutely. That's a great point. I wasn't familiar with those. Those would be really interesting to read up on. But yeah, so in this kind of research, observational studies where you really look at a cross section in time or follow a really big group of people over time without necessarily controlling how much light they were exposed to, that tends to be the overwhelming majority of research that's being conducted in this topic, which makes total sense, and that's quite common in epidemiology. But what's nice about that with meta-analyses, eventually getting back to your initial question, is if you go and take all different studies that you're able to find published on that topic, and you try and through a bunch of different statistical methods, usually meta-analyses are the main way to do that, and you say overall, how do all these results add up and what do they say as a collection of evidence, you can have a lot more confidence in the result that you're talking about on this topic. And the other, so you get a really good confidence compared to a single study to answer a research question like that. And the other thing is feasibility wise, they're relatively straightforward to complete compared to say following up on 200,000 people or something like that, studying a whole population. That's not to say that they're the easiest to complete because there's a lot of different, you have to try and identify all the studies published on that topic. And that's a whole other discussion. But it's
Yeah,
definitely, especially for a student lens, and if you don't necessarily have the resources to do a big population based study, I can definitely see why these things are driving, say, a popularity in that study design.
and I think, and I mean, something that comes up in a lot of STEM fields, certainly not just medicine, is this idea of the crisis of replication, right? This point that yeah, we're not actually doing a lot of work following up on each other and doing that step of the science. And I think these meta studies are an opportunity to, if not replicate, at least cross reference and find interesting indexes. So, like
Hmm.
going back to this allergy study, you went through
Yeah.
six databases.
Yeah, a good number. I
Yeah.
think about that.
How many subjects does that turn out to be?
By subjects, do you mean like number of studies returned or?
Or like individual participants, we could say, like a
Oh,
population count. Is that even part of it by the time you're sifting through data?
uh, that's kind of more a final product when you're writing the study. You go and add up all the individuals. I would have to reference the paper, but it's probably around 1 million.
Oh, geez, that is, and you're so once you have all these indexes and studies together, is it just asking the original studies for their Excel sheets and trying to plug in your own variables? What's the process? I understand the
That's a,
outcome. I see the graphs in
yeah.
front of me, but what's the process on these?
Ah, yeah. I'm really glad you asked. It's something I don't really get to talk about. But so basically, you try and find these search terms. It's like a really fancy Google search is a way to think about it.
Yeah.
And you're putting this into like special search engines through a library that usually your university provides you with, which because they pay these subscriptions to have access to all these journals. And you try and put as many different search terms related to your topic. So you think of all the possible synonyms of artificial light at night, or what could these authors be referring to in their titles that you want to catch that study when you're putting these terms in. And you're running that through all these different databases, so Embase, Medline, PubMed, because they might not necessarily have all the studies on the topic. So you want to have that overlap just to make sure you're catching everything you could be. And then that returns every search result. And what you do is for each of those databases, you download that and you put it into a manager. And the manager is lovely because it saves half your work because it goes and it identifies any duplicates from your search. So for one of our studies, I think we got 10,000 studies. And then after deduplicating, we got about 4,000, which is still a big number.
Oh yeah, but
For this,
it's half the work now. It's half the work. Halfway done. Halfway
exactly,
done right there.
exactly. Oh, and there are many different balances to play with here. Because one of the things is you don't want to miss any studies, but we can't be reviewing 20,000 studies. That's just a ton of work. And how many extra studies are you really going to identify by doing that? So there's a lot of like, it's not as simple as just entering the search terms. There is some playing around with it. So it's pretty interesting from that lens too. But anyways, back to the question. uh, so you get those, and actually, I think the figure 2 in the allergy study is that big flow diagram, kind of taking you through that process. And now in this step, because you can't read every one of those studies, so you're going through the title and the abstract, which is like a little summary of the article. And based on that, you're kind of saying, is this relevant? Is this a study that's going to be included? Can we tell, or do we have to read the full text? If it's yes to either of those, then it goes to the full text review. And usually you're aiming to have around 100 studies in that. That's generally what you end up having. And then ideally you go and you read through those studies to really get a sense of, is this something that answers the question that we want to include in our final review? And then for all of those that you include, you then go and you take their results out. So if a study is really nice for a systematic review and meta-analysis, it'll present all of its results that you'll need in the main manuscript. And that's about as easy as it gets to extract. In some cases, you might need specific data. And if so, then you do your best to contact the author. So every paper will have a corresponding author and it has their contact information, their details and such. And you can email them and say, hey, we are requesting to receive this data for a review. And we've done that, and it depends if they'll get back to you or not. But ideally, to make sure you're as comprehensive as possible, you do reach out to them and try and get that data.
I've
For
just
this
learned that
study,
you don't email anyone during midterms.
Yeah. Oh, man. Yeah, fair enough. But,
This is just me learning. This is what I've had to
oh,
remind myself. Oh, right, the profs have to do midterms too. Don't ask them
oh,
for anything in October.
right. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Oh, but yeah, so for this study, thankfully, all the data we needed was reported by the studies. Sometimes, instead of putting in the main, because there's only so much you can put in the main paper, you can have a supplementary appendix that also gets published with the study. And sometimes they'll put a bunch of extra outcomes and data in there. So it's up to us to go digging through that as well sometimes. And I think in some cases we had to do that, but because of that, we were able to get all the information we needed.
So you sift through these thousands of
Mhm.
pages of data, and you eventually come to the conclusion that yeah, no, it's actually light at night that's just making your allergies worse and your asthma worse. And now that you know that, what can we do with that? What's your prescription?
Right. Um, so it's kind of interesting because I was listening to one of the podcasts, pretty like interesting topic, this restoring darkness.
Yeah, we try, we work hard
Yeah,
at it.
no, absolutely. It's a really cool initiative. And one of the things that came up was unfortunately around this artificial light at night, it's still very much in the generating awareness stage. So, kind of, we're still working to build up all this evidence to make people aware, to kind of give that motivation behind why should we be making this change, right? So with that said, like studies like ours help build that, impetus, that reason to do that. And some of the things, because it hasn't really been tested too much. So this was more in our brainstorming part of our discussion of our results. But so some of the things we recommended, or not necessarily recommend because it hasn't been tested. Ideally, you'd want to say we recommend further investigation around this to see if it even works, right?
Yeah.
Something that was really popular a few years ago, which surprisingly there was kind of contradictory evidence when I looked it up for making the discussion, was these blue light glasses.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Harvard Med just
yeah,
did a really great recommendation on this, where it's like, yeah, probably they work, but we don't know what light source you're looking at, so we don't know what to
yeah,
filter, so we don't know what goggles to recommend. Is what it comes down to. And
right,
I definitely had to deal with a certain kind of commenter after I explained that news article to people.
right. That's very fair. And I think it really comes down to something where it's just really hard to study. Like there's so many variables to account for and like wearing them or not. Yeah.
Well, I mean,
But
there's a sense in which I do think it is a lot like diet research, not dieting, not weight loss, but literally just no seed oils. Is there anything there? Soy? Eggs. We're still jury's still out on eggs. There are
yeah,
too many factors, and there's just nothing about you can't completely control a human's life to get the right answer out of it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was one. The other thing tried to like consider as many potential applications as possible. So our study for the asthma and allergy arm of our project, because we also had it was a really neat international collaboration between people in Spain and the UK and India. So we had this paper focusing on asthma and allergy, another one that recently got published on cancer outcomes, and then another one that's still in the works with journals on mental health outcomes. But for this one, just because there's many different ways to look at artificial light at night exposure, we actually considered three different ways of measuring it just for this paper. So shift work, if they were shift workers or not, chronotype, which if you're familiar, it's more so like an morning and evening chronotype is kind of synonymous, not necessarily identical, but to being, say, an early bird and a night owl, if that makes sense.
No, I mean we definitely talk about chronotype a lot. I
Okay,
think
perfect.
I think I'm very much a lark. I think and I think early bird is a privilege. I think we need to address early bird privilege in society. But that's a whole other thing. I think
Yeah,
let people nap. Let people sleep in.
yeah, exactly. And then we got one study on actual satellite outdoor light at night, which I think is really exciting. It's a really cool way to measure that and I'll get back to that once I like talk about the applications,
Yeah.
because I just think it's a really cool topic, the technology to be able to do that. But some of the applications we were looking at is, okay, so shift workers, a way to reframe this is maybe they're an ultra high exposure group to artificial light at night, because essentially they have to work in artificial light at night.
Yeah, and I
So,
mean, there's different layers of this. There's indoor and outdoor, right? Because
mm-hmm,
I think when we talk about like when I think about it, I think a lot of the data I see from shift workers is usually from nurses because
mm-hmm,
they reliably work night shift and they're pretty easy to talk to in a medical research context. But I think there's also room to talk about particularly drivers, whether that's truck
mm,
drivers or bus drivers. I live in Toronto. We run buses all night, and I'm sure those guys are dealing with light interactions that are completely different from a nurse or me when I was bartending, which is again different levels of light exposure for bartenders too.
right. Exactly. But even like patients in a hospital, right? Because the lights don't go all the way dark at night, right? So even things to consider with that, and what kind of impacts could that be having, right? Yeah, that's a great point.
Absolutely.
Drivers, yeah.
I mean,
Hmm.
we don't think about that too much.
Yeah. And like shift work's understandable for sleep deprivation, but all these other, sequelae that we could be considering. And if we have the research to show there could be a connection, that can promote more research. And then when policies get made up, this could be more evidence to support people who maybe their asthma's getting so exacerbated from their night shift work. And it could be just something, another piece of the puzzle to help them along with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Uh, so so I'm also looking at this cancer study, and this is much bigger. You're covering a much larger cohort, and you're collaborating with more people on this. I can see. So tell me a
Yeah.
bit about that.
Yeah. So that was really exciting because the postdoc in our lab, he's done different postdoctoral fellowships throughout a lot of really impressive research institutions. His name's Dr. Moitra. He just got a professorship in India, so that was a huge step for him in his career. But he was able to connect with all these connections he had made. And one of these big centers is called IS Global. They're based out of Barcelona, Spain. And they have a whole section evaluating environmental exposures to human health. So they were really game because they had done a couple out of this center, a couple of these observational cohort studies looking at that cool satellite data around different cancer risks. So they were really happy to do a meta-analysis just like we did for asthma and allergy, but around cancer outcomes. So the collaboration is really cool because our group at the University of Alberta, where I was at the time, we were able to really handle the asthma and allergy, but we were able to say we set up all the methods and how to, at least a framework of here's how we're thinking we could approach this, and kind of transfer that over to them and say, what do you think of this? Would you be able to do that? And kind of give like a teamwork lens of let's work together on our own projects, but also be there for each other if any questions come up. So it was really cool to collaborate in that way.
And okay, so tell me a little bit more about the satellite thing, because I have like
Yeah.
a mild concern about satellite imaging. So, but you go first.
Yeah, for sure. I'd love to hear what you have to say. But essentially, the way I've learned about it, and when I presented this at a respiratory conference, a Canadian respiratory conference in Toronto in April, I believe, this year, and people are really like, that's an interesting concept. But what they do is they basically take a nighttime view of an area, and the really methodologically robust ones, they'll take an average nighttime view over several months, just to say maybe a light was out one day, or for example. So this gives you a
Well,
better like
there's
overall view.
this episode will release in December, which is
Hmm.
a spike in light at night, if you can believe it. I believe Washington D.C. is the winner. It does still beat out for December lighting.
Oh, interesting.
You think New York, right? But no,
Yeah,
D.C.
interesting. Oh, that's really neat. But yeah, so they'll take an average over say 4 or 6 months, and then what they'll do is they'll go and analyze these pictures pixel by pixel of the satellite data and kind of make an estimate of how much outdoor brightness there is per each pixel, and try and correlate that to people's like home addresses, and then through surveys or other means of getting their health information, try and address, okay, are people living in brighter squares having these worse outcomes that we're studying? And then the one other thing I'll say to this that's interesting is just in the last 20 years, so the cancer group, what they were really looking at is there was an older method of evaluating this data. I think it was the DMSP, a
Mhm.
type of satellite data, and the newer one called VIRS or VIIRS.
Yeah.
And one of the differences, at least from my understanding, is the VIRS gives you a much better spatial resolution. I think like 750
Yeah.
meters, which isn't perfect, but
Yeah.
it's better than say a couple of kilometers.
Yeah.
So you
It
can get
is
more
like when
accurate.
you go pixel by pixel, the pixels are more detailed. They're more granular.
Yeah. Hmm.
All right. So the thing we keep finding out about satellite data is that more recently we are seeing more and more places shift their street lighting and their exterior lighting to LED. And Rayleigh scattering goes both ways, which is to say that when you take photos from outside the atmosphere
Mm,
is blocking the blue component. So
right.
you're noticing an uptick in brightness if your
Hmm.
city is just, pumping out more brightness on those streetlights. But if you've got, say, a city like Paris or Barcelona that's actually doing a better job with their exterior lighting, you're not necessarily noticing the change in spectral power distribution in the same
Oh.
way. So when you do that at a satellite level, you don't always get
Mm.
that now. You get the brightness, but
Oh.
you don't necessarily know if, oh, actually, you know, even now, like
Mm.
East Berlin is more latified than West Berlin, or the other way
Hmm.
around. West Berlin is
Right.
more has more LEDs than East Berlin, even now,
Huh.
because the East side ones are easier to retrofit, or the West side ones
Right.
are easier to retrofit. So
Huh.
what I think I saw a proposal from Spain and Italy a couple of years ago. I think this was at the Roland conference, which was to you do more drone photography or rely on
Oh.
on altitude balloons to try to capture that change in color as well. Because I
Mm.
think a lot of the hazard we talk about is that blue spike that messes with people's health much more than just brightness.
Hmm.
And the other thing is, this is from just last week, Georgia State released a satellite data survey as well. I think you might have read this one. You might be familiar with this, and it was about childhood development. And
Mm.
they were doing the same pixel by pixel analysis and survey method, but they also had to point out it's like, yeah, we're in Georgia. There are other factor when there are other factors about illumination. It's like, yeah, a neighborhood with more light pollution probably has more air pollution, probably has more noise
Hmm.
pollution, probably has
Yeah.
less green space. And they had to point out that, like, look, America is still grappling with some historically bad neighborhoods, and that we have to unpack. So I think, again, it's like diet research. You can't control everything, so we can't
Hmm.
necessarily point to anything but a trend or a correlation sometimes. And that's upsetting. That's frustrating, especially when we're just trying to say, okay, do the thing, fix it. You can fix it. And I'm like, well, yeah.
Yeah.
We don't know necessarily always know what to fix.
Hmm. No, that's a great point because like these observational studies, if you get enough people in them, you can start getting other information about them, like say their age, their income, their proximity to a major highway for air pollution, and you can try and adjust for all these things. But like you said, you still can't because of the study design say this causes this. So yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, it's actually more interesting when I see data from China where it's like, well, all the urbanization happened at the same time at the same rate roughly. And
Mm.
it's interesting to talk about sort of Chinese studies in that way. But
Hmm.
you said you've got a mental health study coming out, and I know you shouldn't talk
We
about
do.
it before you're done, but what can you say about that?
I can say the results overall kind of following a similar trend to what we've been seeing with this other research. Of course, not peer reviewed yet, so I can't, comment on anything definitively, but it'll be really exciting for that one to come out.
All right. And do you have any idea when we might see that? Or is that still
Uh,
or is the process just too much, too unpredictable?
yeah, I'd say it's pretty unpredictable. The peer review process, it's very important, of course, for research to be peer reviewed, but you just can't anticipate how long that might take one journal might be more favorable than another when you submit it, and it might take longer than the next, but hopefully within the next year.
All right. So you're in med school right now.
Hmm.
So what do you do once you actually get to say doctor in front of your name? Are you going into it, do you continue in health research, or where do you go from there? Are you going to be the guy
Mm.
that invents the good goggles for me,
uh,
or is that more of an
it was
optician
really.
job?
I mean, we always got to welcome innovation wherever it comes from. I mean, it was almost overwhelming how many different options there are when you get into med school, all these different specialties. I'm really like in orthopedics right now, kind of falling into my kin roots.
Oh, fair
But
enough.
I do love the population health research, and I really would want to keep doing that, of course.
All right. So I want to thank you for sharing your
Hmm.
expertise and information with us. Before I let you go, any pluggables? If anyone wants to keep track of you, where do we look?
Right. I'd say, if you want to see my future research or the current studies, you can always find my Google Scholar or my ResearchGate account. Those should have, the most up-to-date list of all my publications. You can just find that through searching my name.
I want to thank Andy once again for coming on to discuss his work. I want to thank you for listening all the way through. I hope you can support us either through a one-time or recurring donation to the Lighting in Darkness Foundation, or you could visit the Restoring Darkness merchandise store. They have a number of options for you there. If you need a new hoodie or a new tote bag for anything, I'm hoping that the store can add ties sometime soon. I have to wear a tie to do this show, and it'd be real nice if I had a Howling Wolf logo tie to match the work. But until next time, I have been Scott Walker, and if you can't donate to this series or this foundation, I ask you to do the podcast things: rate, review, recommend. Those do actually help us out. It spreads the word. But until next time, take care of yourself.